The only people that I know who aren't are people who are unhappy in life and been a big disappointment to them.
It was a moment no one saw coming. One day, Dan Blocker was there, towering, warm, and beloved by millions. The next, he was gone. At the peak of his career, Dan seemed untouchable. He held a steady role on one of television's most popular shows, earned the respect of its peers, and captured the hearts of audiences around the world. His life appeared steady, predictable, and secure. There were no warning signs, no whispered rumors, no hint that tragedy was lurking just around the corner. And that is exactly what made his death so devastating. There was no build-up, no public struggle, no foreshadowing. One moment he was planning the future, preparing for the next episode, the next role, the next adventure. The next, the world had lost him. His sudden passing at a relatively young age sent shockwaves through his family, colleagues, and millions of fans who had come to see him as a permanent fixture on their screens. In the aftermath, attention naturally turned to his wife, Dolphia Blocker. In Hollywood, it's almost expected that the spouse of a star will step into the spotlight, giving interviews, attending events, or becoming a public figure in their own right. But Dolphia chose a different path. She stayed silent. She avoided publicity. She refused to let the media dictate her story. Instead, she focused on shielding her family from the glare of fame, letting privacy and quiet dignity define the way she grieved. Over time, her silence became part of the story itself, shaping one of Hollywood's most understated and poignant tragedies. This is the story of Dan Blocker, his rise to stardom, the sudden loss that shocked the world, and the quiet legacy left behind, not just by him, but by the woman who stood beside him, choosing discretion over spectacle. Dan Blocker, the giant who was born to stand out. From the moment he entered the world on December 10, 1928 in DeKalb, Texas, Dan Blocker seemed destined to stand out. His arrival was impossible to ignore. Even as a newborn, his remarkable size stunned everyone who saw him. Family members would later recall how neighbors talked about the baby who seemed larger than life from the very beginning. It was as if the world had been given an early glimpse of the giant he would become. But while his size hinted at greatness, his childhood unfolded during one of the hardest chapters in American history. The Great Depression weighed heavily on families across the country, and the Blockers were no exception. Dan's parents, Ora Shack Blocker and Mary Arizona Blocker, worked tirelessly just to keep their family afloat. When their farm failed, they were forced to leave it behind and start over in the small West Texas town of O'Donnell, Texas. Life there was simple and unforgiving. The family lived in modest rooms above a small grocery store run by Dan's father. Every day demanded effort. Every dollar mattered. Even as a young boy, Dan carried responsibility on his shoulders. He helped stock shelves, carried heavy grocery bags for customers, swept floors, and did whatever work was needed to keep the store running. There was no luxury, only hard work and determination. Yet those difficult years quietly shaped the man he would become. Dan's extraordinary size and strength made him stand out immediately among his classmates. Some were amazed by him, others were a little intimidated, but those who truly knew him saw something even more remarkable than his strength: gentleness. Despite his towering frame, he carried himself with humility and kindness. He didn't use his strength to dominate others. Instead, he used it to help, lifting, carrying, protecting. Those Depression-era lessons, hard work, loyalty, and quiet resilience, became the foundation of his character. Long before Hollywood ever discovered him, before cameras and fame and television screens, Dan Blocker had already become something rare. A giant not just in size, but in heart. Strength, school, and small-town life. Before the world ever knew the name Dan Blocker, the tiny town of O'Donnell, Texas, already had a legend growing up in its dusty streets. People noticed him before he could even tie his own shoes, not because he shouted for attention, but because he didn't have to. Even as a small boy, Dan was enormous. Taller, stronger, and broader than most kids his age, he moved through town like a gentle giant in the making. In a place where everyone knew everyone, his presence was impossible to ignore. Neighbors whispered about the boy who seemed to grow overnight. Children dared each other to test his strength, Adults chuckled when they saw the quiet kid lifting things most grown men struggled with. Yet what surprised people most wasn't his size, it was his heart. Dan was never a bully. Growing up in O'Donnell meant a simple life surrounded by ranches, open skies, and endless fields stretching to the horizon. Entertainment didn't come from television or movie theaters. It came from backyard contests, weekend gatherings, and friendly competitions. And almost every time, Dan was the one everyone wanted to challenge. Arm wrestling, lifting contests, sprint races across dusty fields. More often than not, the outcome was the same. Dan won. But he never bragged. Instead, he laughed with friends, helped neighbors with heavy work, and treated everyone with the same quiet kindness that would define him for the rest of his life. What many people didn't realize was that the giant boy loved something else just as much as strength: books. Behind those broad shoulders was a curious mind. Dan devoured stories and ideas, fascinated by the wider world beyond the borders of his small Texas town. That unusual combination, power and intelligence, would shape everything he became. As a teenager, Dan attended the Texas Military Institute, where discipline sharpened his already impressive presence. On the football field, he was unstoppable, but it was his humility that made teammates respect him even more. Scholarships soon followed, and he eventually enrolled at Sewell Ross State University, balancing athletics with academics. By the time Dan reached adulthood, he was hard to miss, well over 6 feet tall and nearly 300 pounds. But despite his towering frame, he remained the same gentle young man from O'Donnell. The town had raised more than a giant. It had raised a man whose warmth, humor, and quiet strength would one day capture the hearts of millions. Discovering acting by accident. Sometimes the moment that changes your life doesn't arrive with warning. Sometimes it begins with a simple favor. When Dan Blocker entered college at Sewell Ross State University, his future looked predictable. He was studying English, playing football, and following a steady path toward a respectable career. Acting wasn't part of the plan, not even close. Dan was known across campus for two things: his massive size and his calm, disciplined personality. Professors respected him, teammates admired him. Everyone assumed his future would be something practical: teaching, coaching, maybe writing. But fate has a strange sense of humor. One day, the university's drama department ran into a problem. A theater production needed someone strong enough to move heavy stage props during rehearsals. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't acting, it was simply labor behind the scenes. Dan volunteered without thinking much about it. To him, it was just helping out. But during rehearsal, something unexpected happened. One of the professors watched the towering student quietly moving equipment and had a sudden idea. "Why don't you try a role?" the professor suggested. Dan laughed. Acting? That wasn't his world. He was a football player, not a performer. But curiosity nudged him forward. After a little convincing, he agreed to try. Then he stepped onto the stage, and everything changed. The moment he faced the audience, something electric surged through him. The lights, the silence before the first line, the way every pair of eyes focused on him, it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. When the audience reacted, laughing, leaning forward, holding their breath, Dan felt something powerful awaken inside him. For the first time, he realized storytelling wasn't just words on a page, it was alive. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Dan was good, really good. His size gave him presence, but it was his natural humor, warmth, and timing that made people pay attention. The stage felt right. More than football, more than the predictable future he had imagined. Within months, Dan made a decision that stunned many people around him. He changed his major from English to theater. That small favor in a rehearsal hall had quietly rewritten his destiny, because the giant who once moved stage props would one day step onto a television screen, and millions would fall in love with the gentle giant he became on Bonanza. And it all started with a moment that almost never happened: war and the Korean conflict. 1950 should have been another year of football, studies, and tentative acting auditions for Dan Blocker. Instead, life threw him into a situation that would test every ounce of his strength and character. He was drafted into the United States Army during the Korean War. Suddenly, the quiet, towering young man from Texas faced uncertainty, danger, and responsibility on a scale he had never imagined. Basic training in Louisiana revealed what those who knew him in high school had already sensed. Dan was a natural leader. His size and strength made him an imposing figure, but it was his calm confidence and unwavering discipline that set him apart. The football field had taught him teamwork and resilience, and now those lessons became tools for survival. From Louisiana, he was sent to Japan to prepare for deployment with the 45th Infantry Division in Korea, a place where the stakes were no longer measured in yards gained or touchdowns scored. Combat in Korea was relentless, a world of frozen hills, ambushes, and constant danger. On one harrowing patrol behind enemy lines, his unit was ambushed, outnumbered, and trapped under a storm of fire. Amid chaos and panic, Dan stayed composed. He coordinated movements, returned fire, and shielded his fellow soldiers, saving lives even as one comrade was tragically lost. His courage under fire earned him respect and cemented a reputation as someone who could be relied upon when everything fell apart. Over the next 2 years, he faced battles that became legendary: Pork Chop Hill, Outpost Erie, Old Baldy, and Hill 223. Each confrontation demanded more than physical strength. It demanded mental endurance, split-second decision-making, and the harsh reality of life and death responsibility. When he was discharged in 1952, Dan returned home not just as a veteran, but as a man forged by fire. The war had shaped his calm, steady presence, his courage, and his selflessness, qualities that would define both his life and his acting career. Dan Blocker hadn't merely survived the Korean War, he had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to leave a lasting mark, on screens and in the hearts of those who knew him. War changes a man. Imagine stepping off a plane and returning home, but the world you knew feels the same while you are completely different. That was Dan Blocker in 1952. The young man who left Texas full of energy, football dreams, and a carefree spirit came back from the Korean War carrying invisible scars and lessons that would shape every choice he made afterward. War had a way of changing a person in ways no one could see, but everyone could feel. In the chaos of battle, Dan had faced moments that tested not just his strength, but his humanity. Witnessing loss, making life and death decisions, and surviving wounds that could have ended everything, he returned quieter, more thoughtful, and profoundly aware of the fragility of life. Friends and family noticed immediately. The boy who once thrived on competition now moved through life with a careful deliberation. Hunting and firearms, once mere hobbies, were now approached with caution, and he refused to expose his children to the harsh realities he had learned firsthand. Romantic notions of heroism and combat had been stripped away. Dan saw how quickly a situation could spiral into chaos, how easily life could be lost, and how leadership carried a weight far heavier than glory. The discipline, patience, and resilience demanded by the Army became part of him, following him into every role he would later play as a teacher, husband, father, and actor. His calm under pressure and unwavering integrity were lessons forged in distant battlefields far from the Hollywood spotlight. Though he rarely spoke of the war publicly, those closest to him could sense its imprint. The quiet strength, empathy, and reflective nature that defined Dan Blocker didn't come from fame or success. They came from survival, courage, and responsibility. He returned not hardened or bitter, but wiser, carrying a perspective few could understand. The man who returned from Korea was the man the world would come to know, commanding in presence, gentle in heart, and shaped by experiences that left invisible marks as profound as any battlefield wound. War had changed him, but it had also prepared him for the life he was yet to live: marriage, teaching, and family. The life that shaped Dan Blocker. Imagine a man who has faced the chaos of war, the roar of the football field, and the uncertainty of life's crossroads, then chooses the quiet power of love and family over fame. That was Dan Blocker in 1952. This was the year he married Dolphia Parker, a woman whose strength and steadiness would become the anchor of his world. Their union wasn't about grandeur or showmanship, it was about shared values, trust, and building a life that mattered beyond applause. For Dan, this commitment rivaled any personal victory he'd ever known. At the same time, he completed a master's degree in dramatic arts. Hollywood might have been calling, but Dan took a path far less flashy: teaching. He became a high school English and drama teacher in Sonora, Texas, pouring the same dedication, discipline, and patience into his students that had once fueled his football plays and military service. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a presence. Humor and authority balanced perfectly, and students sensed that behind his towering frame was someone who truly cared. A few years later, the Blockers moved to New Mexico, where Dan taught 6th grade. It was quieter, simpler, but it suited him. Teaching gave him a way to share his love for literature and performance while creating a steady, nurturing home. And speaking of home, Dan and Dolphia's house was alive. 4 children, including twin daughters and 2 sons, filled it with laughter, mess, and endless love. Dan's size might have been imposing, over 6 feet tall and nearly 300 pounds, but at home he was gentle and playful. Reading, helping with homework, inventing games, showing that strength and tenderness could exist together. Hollywood seemed far away. Acting was a passion, but it came second to family, teaching, and personal growth. The discipline from the army, the patience from teaching, and the love from home forged a man ready for anything. One day, that foundation would carry him to the spotlight, not just for fame, but to bring warmth, humor, and heart to audiences everywhere. For Dan Blocker, the life he built at home wasn't just a chapter, it was the anchor that made everything else possible. The move toward Hollywood. Texas skies had always been wide and honest, but for Dan Blocker, they were starting to feel small. He had a loving wife, children, and a stable teaching career, but something inside him stirred every time he imagined the bright lights of the screen. Acting wasn't just a dream, it was a pull he couldn't ignore. So, with a mixture of courage and calculated risk, the Blockers packed up their lives and headed west, chasing a future that was uncertain, thrilling, and dangerously close to impossible. California was a land of reinvention. Dan enrolled at UCLA, diving into dramatic arts with the hunger of a man who had spent too long playing by the rules. He soaked up every lecture, every rehearsal, every nuance of performance, determined to sharpen himself into an actor who could command attention, not just with size, but with presence. Yet the realities of family life loomed large. Education didn't pay the bills, so he stepped onto Hollywood sets, auditioning for any role that came his way, cautious but unrelenting. The 1950s television landscape was dominated by westerns, tough, rugged stories that demanded more than just lines on a script. They demanded authority, stature, and a presence that couldn't be taught. Dan had it in spades. His towering frame, broad shoulders, and deep, resonant voice made him instantly noticeable. Small roles soon multiplied, each guest appearance on Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, and Maverick a masterclass in timing, camera awareness, and the subtle art of commanding a scene. Amid the whirlwind of auditions, classes, and family obligations, Dan stayed grounded. Fame wasn't the goal. Craft was. Each step, no matter how modest, was a deliberate move toward a horizon only he could see. California tested him, challenged him, and reshaped him, but it also offered the first real taste of possibility, a chance to transform from a small-town teacher into a name that audiences would never forget. This was more than a career pivot. It was the beginning of a legend in the making, the role that changed everything. It was 1959, and the world of television was about to meet a giant, literally. Dan Blocker, already a working actor with a string of small roles, walked onto a set that would redefine his life forever. The show? Bonanza. The character? Hoss Cartwright, a towering figure with a gentle heart, destined to become one of television's most unforgettable icons. But at the time, no one knew if this Western family drama would survive its first season. When Bonanza premiered, critics were unsure, ratings were shaky, and the airways were crowded with competing shows. The network gambled, moving it to a new time slot, and that tiny shift sparked a revolution. Viewers discovered the Cartwright family, and Hoss, Dan Blocker's embodiment of kindness, humor, and quiet moral strength, became their emotional compass. Standing over 6 feet tall and weighing more than 300 pounds, Dan could have been intimidating. Instead, Hoss was the opposite, a gentle giant whose warmth charmed children and whose integrity earned the admiration of adults. Through him, audiences saw decency in a world often obsessed with conflict and violence. He wasn't just a character on a screen, he was a symbol of honesty, loyalty, and heart. Over 14 seasons, Bonanza grew into a cultural phenomenon, and Dan's Hoss became the beating heart of it. His combination of physical presence and emotional vulnerability made the character unforgettable. For Dan, this role wasn't just a breakthrough, it was transformative. It elevated him from a hard-working actor to a household name, yet he remained grounded, proving that authenticity on screen could leave a legacy far bigger than fame itself. Fame he never wanted. As Bonanza skyrocketed in popularity, millions recognized Dan Blocker on sight, calling out to Hoss Cartwright as if he walked the streets of every town. Yet Dan never craved the spotlight. Red carpets, magazine covers, and Hollywood parties held no allure. For him, acting was a craft, not a ticket to celebrity. He and his wife, Dolphia, built a life rooted in simplicity. Their Northridge, California home became a sanctuary where children could play, homework was done, and family routines reigned. Fame came with attention, fans, photos, and autograph requests, but Dan met it with humor and patience, never letting it dictate his life. Seeking even greater peace, he took a daring step, moving his family to Lugano, Switzerland, a quiet city where few recognized him. There, Bonanza faded into the background, leaving room for ordinary life. Evening walks, family dinners, and the kind of privacy that made him feel rich in the ways money could never buy. Dan Blocker's life was proof that true success isn't measured by the cheers of the crowd, but by the quiet, deliberate choices that protect the people and values we hold dear. Fame was never his goal. Love, family, and integrity were. And in that, he was and remains a giant in every sense that truly matters. The sudden tragedy, a life cut short. It was 1972, and Dan Blocker was back on familiar ground, ready to step onto the Bonanza set once more. For over a decade, Hoss Cartwright had been more than a role. It was a piece of Dan himself, a character whose gentle strength and humor had captured the hearts of millions. Life seemed steady, predictable even, but fate has a way of rewriting plans in an instant. Just then, a shadow crept into the routine. Dan began experiencing health issues, gallstones that demanded surgery. The doctors promised it was routine, low risk, a simple step toward recovery. Confident, Dan went under the knife, expecting to return to his family and the life he loved within days. His colleagues and loved ones shared that hope, believing the familiar laughter of Hoss would echo through the studio again. At first, everything appeared fine. The surgery seemed successful. Recovery was underway. Then, without warning, disaster struck. A pulmonary embolism, a blood clot, ripped through his lungs. The shock was instantaneous. At just 43, the man who had been a beacon of warmth, integrity, and humor on screen was gone. The nation reeled. Children who adored Hoss, adults who admired Dan's quiet kindness, and millions of fans felt the void left behind. On set, the loss was devastating. Michael Landon, Lorne Greene, and the entire Bonanza family confronted a silence where Dan's laughter and steady presence once lived. A chapter of television history ended abruptly, leaving grief and disbelief in its wake. Dan Blocker's death is a stark reminder life can pivot on a single unpredictable moment. One day he was planning the next episode, the next, the world had lost its gentle giant. Yet, even in absence, his impact endured, etching Hoss Cartwright permanently into hearts and history alike. The quiet legacy, love that shields and endures. In the aftermath, while headlines mourned and fans wept, one person quietly took the reins. Dolphia Blocker, Dan's devoted wife. She withdrew from the public eye, declined interviews, and shielded her children from the glare of fame. Her choice wasn't avoidance, it was protection, a deliberate act to preserve the family and the essence of the man she loved. Off-screen, Dan had been much like Hoss, kind, grounded, deeply devoted to family. Fame never changed him. Humility, honesty, and compassion defined his life. Those values, carefully nurtured by Dolphia, became the living legacy that outshone any media frenzy. Over the years, Bonanza endured as a touchstone of television storytelling, with Hoss Cartwright standing as a timeless symbol of heart, integrity, and courage. Children who never met Dan still learn empathy and loyalty from the character he embodied so effortlessly. Through Dolphia's quiet vigilance and Dan's own authentic life, his story survives, unspoiled by gossip, unmarred by sensationalism. Dan Blocker's greatness wasn't just on screen, it was in the lives he touched, the love he gave, and the legacy of integrity he left behind. Even in tragedy, his presence lingers, proof that true impact is measured not by fame, but by the enduring power of kindness, family, and heart.